Chess is one of the oldest and most respected board games of mankind. Chess is believed to originate almost 1500 years ago in India during the 6th century, and since then it has been widely talked about from books to television and even music. Today, chess is more popular than ever, with many believing it gauges intelligence. This is one of the many reasons why more and more people are learning how to play chess every single day. But how do you play chess? Well, that is why I am here, to help introduce the most important parts of chess, from how the pieces move, all the way to the basic strategic concepts in this ultimate guide for the new chess player. Today, you'll be learning about the 8 most important parts of the game of chess, and of course, we must start with the most important part, the chessboard itself. The board you use for chess has the measurements of 8 squares by 8 squares, giving you a total 64 squares. 32 of them are light and the other 32 are dark. Although it may not seem useful to know about the colors of the squares, they can actually help you keep track of how certain pieces move. Each square of the chessboard has a specific coordinate ranging from 1 to 8 from the bottom to the top, and the letters A to H from the left to the right. It is important to remember these coordinates, as they can help you take notation, the language used in chess to have the ability to replay your own games as well as famous games in history. When setting the board up, it is important to remember that the board should be set up with A1 being a dark square. Now that we've covered the board, it is time to move on and learn about the pieces that make up the game of chess. The first piece we will cover is the pawn. Not only are they the most common, but they are also the most complicated of the 6 chess pieces. First, they are placed all along the 2nd row for white, and for black, they are placed along the 7th row instead. While on their starting position, pawns can move either 1 square or 2 squares forward, and after they have moved, they are only allowed to move 1 square after that. It is important to remember that pawns cannot move backwards, so make sure to make your pawn moves carefully. Unlike every other piece, pawns do not capture the same way that they move. Rather, they can only capture diagonally. If a pawn can reach the opposite side of the board, then it seems like it is now useless, unable to capture or move, but that is not the case, as once a pawn has reached the opposite side of the board, depending on what side you're on, it could be the 1st or the 8th rank, it can now promote to either a knight, a bishop, a rook, or even a queen. A pawn is able to promote to any of these pieces mentioned, regardless of what has been taken off the board already. Lastly, one of the most recent additions to the game of chess is en passant, introduced in the 15th century. This special rule prevents a pawn from using the 2-square advance without risk of being captured as if they only moved 1 square. The rule states that if the 2-square advance is made, you are able to capture that pawn with, and only with, another pawn as if it moved 1 square, but only as a follow-up. If your immediate response is not to capture the pawn as if it has moved 1 square, then the move is no longer available. Pawns have the lowest value, but are the backbone of the game. If you can master how pawns move and form your plans accordingly, it is believed you can master chess. Pawns are best used to gain space for your other pieces, as well as being a great protector of not only your king, but other pieces as well. Pawns are considered the skeleton of chess, as their placements often decide your plans, but more on that later. It is important that you see pawns first, because every other piece, except for the king, is valued by how many pawns it is normally worth in an average game of chess. The second piece we will be covering is the rooks. Believed to be worth 5 pawns in value, these pieces belong in all 4 corners, A1 and H1 for white, and for black, A8 and H8. Rooks can move laterally, meaning from side to side, forwards, and backwards. Unlike pawns, they can only capture the same way that they move. Rooks are unable to jump over pieces, whether they are your own or your opponent's. Rooks will rarely get any use in the opening, though in the middle game, they are especially good with open files, as this is where pieces get the most options, to move around the board. Next up are the knights. Often believed to be worth about 3 pawns, these pieces belong on the b1 and g1 squares for white, and the b8 and g8 squares for black. Knights move in an L shape, and unlike other pieces, knights are able to jump over other pieces as well. At most, knights will have 8 potential moves, but if they are in the corners or at the side of the board, they will have less options. This is why knights are considered to be short-range pieces, and are best in the center, where they usually have more options. The knights are often immediately useful in the opening and the middle game, but they may suffer compared to some stronger pieces in the endgame. Knights primarily benefit from closed positions, but more on that later. Next, we have the bishops. These minor pieces are believed to be worth roughly 3.5 pawns. The bishops belong on the squares c1 and f1 for white, and c8 and f8 for black. Bishops move in a diagonal manner, and this is one of the many reasons why having the board color scheme helps, as this helps you easily see where your bishops have the ability to move. Both sides have one of each, a light squared bishop and a dark squared bishop. The bishops cannot change colors, as they can only move diagonally, meaning that they will always stay on the same color. Bishops benefit greatly in open positions and can be used to move swiftly around the board with ease. Now, we must talk about the most powerful piece in the game of chess. The queen is normally valued at a whopping 9 pawns. For white, this piece belongs on the d1 square, and for black, on the opposite, the d8 square. The queen has the abilities of the rook and the bishop combined, being able to move laterally and diagonally as many squares as it pleases. Though do remember that it cannot jump over pieces, as only the knight has this ability. The queen is phenomenal at attacking and defending, as it can move around the board with ease. The queen will benefit from being centralized, controlling files, or controlling key central squares and pieces. Lastly, we have the most important piece in the game of chess. The king objectively does not have a point value, as if it is captured, the game will be lost. For white, the king resides on the e1 square, and for black, the e8 square. The king is like a worse queen in the way that it moves around the board. The king can move one square in any direction, diagonally or laterally. One of the best ways to keep the king safe is at the side of the board. Since the king is the most important piece, there are a few rules that need to be followed when you are working with this piece. The first one is castling. This allows you to move your king to the side of the board in just one move. This can only be done as long as there are no pieces between your king and your rook that you wish to make this maneuver with. Your king and rook cannot have moved in the game already, and the squares that the king will move cannot be attacked by an enemy piece. Lastly, the king is unable to castle if it is currently being attacked. If all of these rules are followed, the king can move 2 squares to the left or to the right, and the rook is then transferred over to the opposite side of the king. If you castle long, your king will be on the c file, and your rook that was on the a file will now be on the d file. If you castle short, then your king will be on the g file, and your h rook will now be on the f file. The next rule about the king is that you cannot move into check. This is considered to be illegal, as it would be an instant loss if you were to do so. If you have a piece attacking your king, there are only 3 ways you can deal with this. Either by capturing the piece that is attacking your king, blocking the attack by interposition, or by moving your king out of the opponent's sight. If the king is in check and is unable to move out of the way, block the check, or capturing the attacking piece, the game is now over, as this is checkmate. Now that you know how the pieces move, we need to go over a few of the special rules that are necessary to know and able to play the game of chess. The first rule you'll come by is that if you get checkmated, you lose the game, or if you checkmate your opponent, then you will win the game. However, you can also lose the game if you run out of time. So make sure you're aware of how much time you have left when you're playing. Many may think that in chess you only win or lose, but in fact, it can be tied as well. Unlike winning or losing, there are multiple ways that a game can be drawn. The first way a chess game can be drawn is from stalemate. Stalemate is a term used when one side has no legal moves, but is not in check. For example, in this position on the board, if the queen moves to g6 and the king is on h8, it is unable to move, and this results in stalemate, as there are no legal moves and the king cannot move into check. Next up is threefold repetition. This is one of the only ones that can happen in an opening, middle game, or an endgame. If a position is repeated 3 times on the board, either player can claim a draw. In this case, if both players would like to continue the game, they can, but in most cases, one of the players will or should claim the draw. A very common way that people may draw is if almost every single piece on the board has been captured except for a lone knight or a bishop. In this case, the game is drawn because it is impossible to checkmate with just a lone bishop or knight, no matter how hard you try. The 50 move rule is the last possible way to draw, and it is also the least likely one to show up out of these possibilities. As well as stalemate, it is almost exclusively found in the endgame. This rule states that if no pawn moves or captures have been made in the last 50 moves, either player can claim a draw. Just like the threefold repetition, one of the 2 players have to claim the draw to make it official, but in most cases, one of them will. Checkmating is an essential part of the game of chess, and to have a better understanding of how to utilize your pieces, it is important to see the bare essentials needed in order to give checkmate. This will help you realize how powerful each piece really is. The pieces, along with the king's help, that can deliver a checkmate are the queen, the rook, 2 bishops, and a bishop and a knight. If you wish to learn any of these checkmating patterns, there will be resources provided in the description. Now we must talk about tactics. Tactics are an essential part of the game of chess. You may or may not be aware of the term, chess is 99% tactics, which is a common saying that has been thrown around for years. Whether or not many chess players genuinely believe this, there is at least some merit behind the saying. Tactics can occur at any part of the game, from the opening to the endgame. Most themes are made up of multiple forcing moves that gain an edge or end up giving checkmate. There are countless tactical themes in chess. Some of these include the back rank mate, the double attack, a discovered check, or even a term called zugzwang. Some of the most common themes that occur at lower levels has to do with keeping their pieces safe, whether they're trapped or undefended. Oftentimes you will also see their pawns being undefended, which many beginners may not value as much as they should. When looking for tactics in your own game, it helps to look for forcing moves. There are 3 levels of severity in which forcing moves are classified. The first and most important one is checks, which attack the king and force a response due to the rules of the game, stating that if you are in check, the only way to continue is by getting out of it. Number 2 is a capture, which is less severe than a check, but it is very important nonetheless. In many cases, this has to do with a term called trading, when you capture a piece of equal or less value, knowing that your piece will also be captured. This is usually done because after the recapture, there may be a particular weakness to take advantage of. Though there are different possibilities as to why a capture was made, such as capturing a piece worth more material, which is how many games are won. This is not considered the least important of the three because of the importance of the response of your opponent. Lastly, we have number 3, which is a threat. The least severe of the three options. This could be the threat of a mating attack, winning a piece, or even just a pawn. There are many more complex examples of all three of these forcing moves that you may look for, but they do serve as a good guideline to follow if you are having trouble finding out what move to make. Now that we cover tactics, it is time to cover each segment of the game, starting with the opening. The opening is the first of 3 sections of the game of chess. Opening play will dictate many things, like how the pawn structure will stay until the middle game, or in some cases even the endgame. The opening may also dictate what imbalances the players will have for the rest of the game. For example, bishop versus knight, 2 minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, and many others. Believe it or not, the opening is the least important part of the game to study for novice players. Many beginners will waste their time with remembering starting moves played from strong players without knowing what these moves actually do and try to achieve. Instead, a better way to improve is to play according to some guidelines that many people from novice to master level follow to achieve a good position when entering the middle game. The first guideline is to control the center. Contrary to popular belief, making moves at the side of the board like a4 or h4 don't actually accomplish much, as many of your pieces will not have any freedom to move around to achieve any plans you may have. Controlling the center will give you space to move your pieces, which is essential to maximize your options later in the game. The second guideline is to develop your pieces. Once you have your share of the center, it is time to develop your pieces. Oftentimes, many people will develop knights first, and then bishops to follow, as knights will often control more of the center than a bishop. For example, here is a knight on f3 and a bishop on c4. The knight covers the d4 and e5 squares, whereas the bishop only covers the d5 square. The final guideline is king safety. Once you have developed your pieces, it is time to get your king to safety by castling on either side of the board, or very, very rarely staying in the center. More often than not, you should be castling short, meaning castling towards the closest rook to your king, as it puts your king closer to the corner. King safety is crucial and is the final step of the opening, as it'll often dictate how play will happen in the middle game. If you follow these rules, you will now enter the middle game with a playable position. The middle game is a section of the game which is far more important than the opening. The middle game picks up when the opening ends. Your pieces should be developed, your king should be safe, and your pawns will now be structured in a defined manner. They may be locked, meaning the pawns are unable to move forward, or the pawns may be fluid, meaning that the pawns still have a ton of options when moving, meaning they can soon become further defined by whether or not pawn trades occur. There are 2 other classifications of pawn structures that don't have to do with the options that the pawns may have. The first classification is the open position. This occurs when 2 or more pawns have been traded for both black and white. In these positions, it is often beneficial to have bishops over knights due to their ability to move from one side of the board to the other in a quick manner. When dealing with open positions, it is best to remember that having a lot of piece mobility is very important, as having more options gives you more opportunities to get an advantage. The second pawn structure classification is the closed position. Closed positions occur when less than 2 pawns have been traded for both black and white. In closed positions, more often than not, knights will have a slight edge over bishops due to their ability to move around the board by jumping over any obstacles along the way, and their unique moving pattern. In closed positions, you may see that your pawn chain faces a certain way. If this is the case, you will likely want to form your plans of attack on that side of the board. A very instructive position is the King's Indian defense. Here is an example. The position is closed in this opening. However, there are 2 important things you may notice about the position. The first is that white has more space than black. This generally means that white has a slight advantage. The second thing is that white has more space on the queen side, which means they should be moving their pieces to that side of the board. Whereas black has more space on the king side, meaning that black wants to form an attack on that side of the board. A general tip for the middle game that is useful for any point of the game really, is that you should try to think consciously about each move you make and what it will do and no longer do after you make it. For example, in this position, there is a common mistake. Black played the move knight to a5, which seems like a reasonable move, as it threatens to trade knight for bishop in a fluid pawn structure, which normally the bishops may be favored. However, black did not abide by checking what the knight no longer does, and in this position, although black will be able to take the bishop for the knight, white will have a serious edge because of the move knight takes e5, winning a pawn. Now that we covered the essentials of the middle game, we must now talk about the most important part of chess. The endgame is the final stage of chess, and it is undoubtedly the most important. There is no clear definition as to when middle games end and when endgames begin. However, for the sake of simplicity, we will describe it as the point in which you want to start activating your king, when it goes from being a piece you need to protect to a piece which starts making threats of its own. Although many people believe that the endgame is the most important part of chess, why is this? There are actually many reasons, but the most important is that in the endgame, there isn't such a thing as slightly better or slightly worse. Instead, there is either winning, lost, or just drawn. The ultimate goal of the game is to checkmate, and to do this when in the endgame, it is crucial to promote your pawns, as it will be very difficult to checkmate without doing so. Although, of course, just like any guideline, there are exceptions. In the endgame, pawns are worth more here than in any previous stage of the game, because of their ability to promote, which has become a deciding factor of countless games at every single level. When trying to promote your pawns, each and every move is crucial, so much so that an individual move made by a player is named a tempi. Tempi are important because you may need to calculate forcing moves in order to have your pawn promote. Though a good rule of thumb to follow is whether or not it will be easy for your opponent to just take the pawn if you push it prematurely. When in the endgame, a common occurrence is the simplification into a position where all pieces except for pawns have been traded off the board. Before this trade occurs, it is important to ask yourself 3 questions in this level of severity. Number 1 is, am I able to promote my pawns faster than my opponent, or is my opponent faster than me? The second question is, how much material does my opponent have, and how much material do I have? The final question is my king positioned better or worse than my opponent? These 3 factors can be the difference between a win and a loss depending on your choices. Here's an example. In this position, it is white to move, and white is able to trade bishops. Should they do it? Well, white does have one pawn more than black, and in normal circumstances, this would be enough to win. However, what about king position? As you can see, both kings seem to have the same amount of activity as each other. So according to these two rules, the position seems to be winning for white. However, there is one more question we must ask. Whose pawns are faster to promote? And here we can see that black is actually far quicker than white, meaning that if white were to trade bishops, this would be a catastrophic mistake. Instead, white should keep the bishops on the board to defend and hold a draw by giving up the a2 pawn. A continuation that may occur is bishop to c6, bishop takes a2, b4, king to e5, b5, bishop to e6, b6, bishop to c8, b7, and now here's the crucial move, bishop takes b7. And after white recaptures, white is up a bishop. However, this position is a draw because white is unable to checkmate with just a lone bishop. And the bishop controls the h1 square, so black will never be able to promote their pawn. That concludes all of the necessary information that a beginner should know, including how the pieces move, the rules of the game, how to find tactics and moves in your games, as well as some basic strategies to follow when in the opening, the middle game, and in the endgame. If you wish to learn more about any specific subject mentioned in this video, I have provided free online resources in the description, from videos to chess blogs. If you want to learn more about chess and how to play or improve your game, make sure to subscribe for more videos every week. Thanks for watching.